May 2nd, 1863. 9:21 p.m. The wilderness of Virginia. The moon has not yet risen. The night is absolute. The woods around Chancellorsville are a black wall of scrub oak and pine so dense you cannot see your hand in front of your face. The air smells of gunpowder, wood smoke, and the metallic sweetness of blood. The battle is technically over for the day, but the darkness is alive with sound. Scattered musket fire pops in the trees. Nervous pickets are shooting at shadows. Horses scream somewhere in the brush. Men stumble through the undergrowth, lost, bleeding, calling for their regiments. On a dirt track called the Mountain Road, a small group of horsemen rides slowly through the dark. They are moving forward, toward the enemy lines, into the no man's land between the armies. The man at the center of this group is not supposed to be here. He is the second most valuable human being in the Confederate States of America. He is the hammer of God. He is the man who moves faster than the enemy thinks is possible, who strikes harder than the math of his own army should allow. He is Thomas Jonathan Jackson, Stonewall. He is 39 years old. He is riding Little Sorrel, a small, plain, nondescript horse that looks nothing like the animal you'd expect a legend to ride. Jackson himself looks nothing like a legend. He is not handsome. He is not polished. He is a large, angular, sunburned man with enormous hands and a thick, unkempt beard going prematurely gray. He holds his left hand up in the air constantly, as if asking a question, a personal quirk he never fully explained. He believes in dietary discipline, sucking on lemons to aid his digestion. He believes in absolute silence, absolute secrecy, and absolute violence. He is scouting the enemy position in person because that is what he does. He needs to see it himself. He doesn't trust secondhand reports. He wants to look at the Union line with his own eyes and determine if there is any possibility of a night attack. The Union Army of the Potomac under Joe Hooker is just a few hundred yards through those dark trees. They are a beaten army. Jackson has just executed the greatest flanking march of the Civil War. He marched 28,000 men 12 miles through dense forest in a single day in complete secrecy and hit the Union right flank like a freight train at 5 o'clock in the evening. He shattered 2 entire Union corps. He sent 40,000 men running through the woods, screaming. And now, in the darkness, he wants to finish it. He is the only Confederate general who could think it. He is the only Confederate general who would try it. His staff urges him to turn back. "General, it is too dangerous. The ground is unknown. The men are jumpy. It is almost 10 o'clock. Turn back." Jackson ignores them. He turns back anyway, finally, a few minutes later. His mind has what it needs. He has seen the road. He has seen where the next blow will fall. He turns Little Sorrel around. He is riding back toward his own lines. Then the sound, a single volley, then a second, then a ragged, panicked roar. The 18th North Carolina Infantry is in those trees. They are Confederate soldiers, exhausted and terrified after hours of brutal fighting. They hear horsemen coming through the darkness from the direction of the enemy. Their lieutenant shouts an order. Who goes there? There is no clear answer. Maybe a response. Maybe silence. No one will ever be fully certain. The lieutenant shouts again. It is the wrong men. Pour it into them, boys. The night erupts. Jackson is hit 3 times in the span of 2 seconds. 2 balls tear through his left arm. 1 rips into his right hand. Little Sorrel bolts in terror, crashing through the brush, branches slashing Jackson's face, nearly decapitating him on a low-hanging limb. He is thrown against the saddle, barely conscious, barely holding on. His staff catches him. They pull him down. They carry him in their arms through the dark forest, stumbling over roots, falling into ditches, as the musket fire continues around them. One of his staff officers, Captain Boswell, is killed in the same volley. Another is wounded. They carry the most dangerous man in the Confederate Army through the woods on a makeshift litter, and somewhere along that dark road, the trajectory of the Civil War bends so far, it will never bend back. To understand what Robert E. Lee felt when he heard this news, you have to understand what Stonewall Jackson actually was to him. This was not a general and a subordinate. It was not an employer and an employee. It was something rarer and stranger. It was a partnership of minds so completely complementary that together they functioned as a single military entity that the Union Army could not solve. Lee was the brain. He saw the grand board. He looked at a map and he saw possibility where other generals saw impossibility. He was bold to the point of recklessness. He was willing to split his army in the face of a superior enemy, to run 2 separate operations simultaneously, to gamble everything on the premise that his men would do what he asked and the enemy would do what he feared. He fought with the psychology of a poker player who believes his opponent will fold. But Lee had a limitation. He was a gentleman. He was raised in the Virginia aristocracy. He gave suggestions. He gave discretionary orders. He said phrases like, if practicable and at your earliest convenience. His subordinate generals often misread him. They heard his polite suggestions as optional instructions. They exercised their own judgment, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes catastrophically. Jackson was different. Jackson did not require politeness. He did not need elaboration. Lee would look at a map, describe the general intention, and Jackson would execute it with such speed, such ferocity, and such complete disregard for the normal limits of human endurance that the enemy never had time to respond. Jackson understood Lee's intent without needing Lee to spell it out. He read the mind of his commander and translated it into crushing military violence. Chancellorsville was the proof. Lee had 60,000 men. Hooker had 130,000. The math said retreat. Every conventional military textbook said retreat. Lee divided his army in the face of a superior enemy, a move so insane that West Point would have failed you for suggesting it on an exam. He sent Jackson with 28,000 men on a 12-mile march around the entire Union Army, while he held the front with barely 12,000 men, staring down 70,000 Union soldiers. 12 miles through dense forest in one day, without being detected. Only Jackson could do it. Only Jackson would do it. The march was a masterpiece of secrecy and speed. When Jackson's men emerged from the tree line on the Union right flank at 5 in the afternoon of May 2nd, they found Union soldiers sitting around their campfires eating dinner. The rifles were stacked. The men were playing cards. General Oliver Howard's 11th Corps was relaxing in the late afternoon sun, completely unaware that the Army of Northern Virginia was standing 60 yards behind them in the woods, 28,000 men silent as ghosts, loading their rifles. The rebel yell went up. The slaughter was instant. Howard's corps ran. They threw down their weapons. They ran through the camps of the other corps, screaming that the whole Confederate army was behind them. Mules stampeded, supply wagons overturned. It was a rout so complete and so sudden that it looked less like a battle and more like a natural disaster, a wave crashing through an unsuspecting shore. And then the darkness came. And the North Carolina boys opened fire on the wrong horsemen. This is what Lee is reading at 11 p.m. He is in his tent at the headquarters outside Chancellorsville. He is sitting at a small folding table with a candle. His face is a rigid mask because a Confederate general cannot appear shaken. His staff is watching him from the corners of the room. The messenger reads the dispatch. Jackson is hit, left arm and right hand. Prognosis uncertain. Lee does not speak for a long moment. Then he says something that his staff would repeat for the rest of their lives. He says it quietly, almost to himself. Any victory is dearly bought which deprives us of the services of General Jackson, even for a short time. He is still not accepting the worst. He cannot accept the worst. The tactical situation in the morning is still unresolved. Hooker's army is beaten but not destroyed. There is still a battle to be won. Lee cannot fold his hands and grieve. He sends a message back to Jackson. You are better off than I am, for while you have lost your left arm, I have lost my right. Read that sentence again, not metaphorically, not as a pleasantry, as a precise military assessment of what has just happened to the Army of Northern Virginia. Jackson is Lee's right arm. Jackson is the mechanism by which Lee's plans become reality. Without him, Lee has an intent, but no certainty of execution. The surgeons work through the night. The arm is beyond saving. They amputate it below the shoulder, 3 inches from the joint, in a tent lit by a single lantern, while the sound of sporadic gunfire filters through the canvas walls. Jackson takes the chloroform calmly. He is a deeply religious man. Whatever happens is God's will. He holds no terror for death. He survives the surgery. Lee gets the update in the morning. He is relieved. He goes back to fighting the battle. He He continues the battle over the next 2 days without Jackson. He wins. It is still his masterpiece. He beats Hooker's 130,000 men with his 60,000. He splits his army not twice, but 3 separate times, dancing between 4 Union threats simultaneously. He is conducting a symphony without his lead violinist and still producing music. But something is different. The killing blow never lands. Hooker retreats north across the Rappahannock River, battered but alive, his army intact. At Fredericksburg months earlier, Lee had called it a great slaughter, but no victory. Chancellorsville is the same. A dazzling tactical triumph that changes nothing strategic. The Union Army survives to fight again. With Jackson at full speed, the night attack on May 2nd would have happened. Jackson would have driven through the Union rear before Hooker could reorganize. The Army of the Potomac would have been cut off from its river crossing. The war in the East might have ended in that Virginia forest. It didn't. Then the news from the medical tent gets worse. Jackson contracts pneumonia. It moves fast. In 1863, pneumonia is a death sentence. There are no antibiotics. There is no oxygen. There is quinine and prayer. The doctors do what they can. His wife Anna is sent for. She arrives with their infant daughter Julia, whom Jackson has never seen. He holds the baby girl on May 7th for the first time. He studies her face. He makes the kinds of quiet, careful observations that he made about everything. Methodical, precise. He decides she looks like him. He seems genuinely pleased about this, because Jackson has a grim soldier's sense of humor about his own physical appearance. He seems to be recovering. He is weak, but he is conscious. He is talking. Then the pleurisy sets in alongside the pneumonia. His right side becomes inflamed. He cannot take a deep breath without agony. He runs a fever that climbs past 104 degrees. The doctors apply cold compresses. They bleed him, because medicine in 1863 still believes in bleeding. It makes him weaker. By Sunday, May 10th, it is clear he is going to die. His mind begins to wander. He speaks in fragments. He is issuing orders to men who are not there. He is back on the battlefield. He calls for A.P. Hill, his division commander. He shouts that the troops must press forward. Then the voice softens. He is somewhere else now. His face, which has been rigid and strained for days, relaxes. The people in the room lean closer. His breathing becomes shallow. Then, in a clear, calm, almost tranquil voice, completely at odds with the labored breathing and the damp sheets and the flickering candle, Jackson speaks his last words. "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." He closes his eyes. He is gone. Robert E. Lee is informed on the afternoon of May 10th. There are several accounts of his immediate reaction, and they all say the same thing. He does not read the dispatch at his desk. He is in his tent, lying on his cot, still recovering from the exertion of the battle. An aide enters. He reads the message without inflection. Lee turns his face to the wall. He doesn't speak for several minutes. When he finally speaks, his voice is barely above a whisper. He said, "I know not how to replace him." 5 words, and in those 5 words is the most precise and honest military assessment Lee ever made. Because in 1863, surrounded by competent generals, brave men, skilled officers, Lee understood something that he could not say aloud without undermining his entire command structure. There was no one else. You cannot understand the catastrophe of what follows without understanding what made Jackson irreplaceable. It was not bravery. The Confederate Army had no shortage of brave men. It was not technical competence. There were excellent generals in that army. It was a specific, rare, almost ungovernable quality that Jackson possessed, and no one else in that command structure did. It was the willingness to act without permission. The American Civil War was fought by officers trained at West Point in the culture of the chain of command. You followed orders. You executed orders. You reported back and waited for new orders. The system worked in a conventional war. It failed against Robert E. Lee because Lee did not fight a conventional war. Lee needed a subordinate who could hear his intent, absorb it completely, and then execute with such aggressive violence and independent judgment that the enemy couldn't react in time. The loop from Lee's mind to Confederate boots on the ground had to be short, and it had to be fast. With Jackson, the loop was almost non-existent. Lee would say, "March there." Jackson would be there before Lee expected it. Lee would say, "Hit the flank." Jackson would hit the flank and the rear and the supply line before Lee had finished giving the order. The men who replaced Jackson were capable soldiers. Richard Ewell, Ambrose Powell Hill, both had stellar records. Both were physically brave. Both were effective commanders at the division level, but neither of them was wired the way Jackson was wired. Ewell, in particular, was a problem that the history books tend to understate. He had served under Jackson for 2 years. He had been trained to wait for Jackson's explicit orders before moving. Jackson didn't share his plans. Jackson didn't explain himself. You waited until the orders came, and then you ran. Ewell knew how to run. He didn't know how to decide when to run. He would discover, catastrophically, that Robert E. Lee expected his corps commanders to exercise Jackson-level judgment with Jackson-level initiative. He would discover this at Gettysburg on the evening of July 1st, 1863, less than 2 months after Jackson's death. Less than 2 months after those 5 words, "I know not how to replace him." Lee had taken the army north into Pennsylvania. The tactical context you already know. The collision at Gettysburg was accidental, unplanned. But by the afternoon of July 1st, the Union forces had been driven back through the town in a route that looked exactly like the kind of opportunity Jackson lived for. The Union soldiers were running. They were streaming back through the streets of Gettysburg, disorganized, bloodied, fleeing toward the high ground south of town. Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill. If the Confederates could take that high ground before the Union could reorganize and dig in, the battle was essentially over. Whoever held the high ground held the battle. Lee looked at the situation. He looked at Ewell. He gave the order, "Take that hill if practicable." If practicable. He said it the way he always said things, with the Virginia gentleman's instinct to soften an order into a suggestion. He had said the same kind of thing to Jackson 100 times. Jackson never interpreted it as a question. Jackson always interpreted it as a command with implied urgency. Jackson would have been on that hill before the sentence was finished. Ewell looked at his tired men. He looked at the sun dropping toward the horizon. He looked at the disorganized state of his own corps after a day of hard fighting. He calculated the risks. He considered the practicability. He decided it was not practicable. He stopped. The Union soldiers stumbled up onto that hill. They collapsed behind the stone walls and the cemetery fence posts. They gasped for breath. Their officers screamed at them to stop running, to turn around, to pick up their rifles. Within an hour, they had transformed a panicked mob into a defensive line. The next morning, the high ground was fortified. The trap was set. Lee had to attack uphill. 2 days later, Pickett's charge. 15,000 men walking across a mile of open Pennsylvania ground into the mouths of the Union cannons. You know what happened. What the history books call the high water mark of the Confederacy began to recede in a Virginia tent on May 10, 1863, with the last breath of a man who sucked on lemons and held his left hand in the air and moved faster than the physics of the 19th century should have allowed. There is one more thing that history does not fully confront. Lee knew. He knew what he was losing. He knew, in real time, watching Jackson die, that the campaign season ahead was going to be different. He had already been planning the Pennsylvania invasion when Jackson got shot. He had already sketched the logic of it, the necessity of bringing the war north to relieve pressure on Virginia, to force a peace by threatening Washington. He believed in the plan. He believed his army could do it. But in the back of his mind, in the place where a general keeps the cold mathematics that he cannot share with his staff, because morale is also a weapon, Lee understood that the plan required someone who could read his intentions and execute them without hesitation. He sent Jackson a message while Jackson still lay in the hospital, feverish and recovering from the amputation. He could not visit in person. The tactical situation demanded his presence at the front. He could not leave his lines. This is a fact that haunted Robert E. Lee for years afterward. He sent his most important subordinate off to die in a tent, and he never sat beside him. He never held his hand. He never had the conversation that the two of them deserved. He sent a message instead. He told Jackson that he wished he was injured in his place, not Jackson's place in his. He said that the wound was to the army, not to the man. He said that Jackson should focus on recovery, that he needed him, that they had work yet to do together. it was never delivered. By the time the message reached the hospital, Jackson was drifting in and out of consciousness, fighting the fever that was eating him alive. Whether he heard it read aloud is uncertain. Whether he understood it is unknowable. What is certain is that Lee never replaced the conversation with another one. After Jackson died, Lee attended the funeral in Richmond. He stood in the crowd like every other mourner. He did not speak a eulogy. He could not trust himself to speak. His chief of staff later wrote that in all the years he served Lee, he saw the general's composure break fully on only 2 occasions. Once was the moment he heard Jackson had been shot. The other was standing at the coffin. The marble man cracked at that box. He put his hand on the gray uniformed shoulder of the corpse. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally turned away, he said to the aide beside him, "Without Jackson, the army is not the same army. Not was not the same army. Is not." Present tense, because the army was still out there, still fighting, still marching, still wearing the gray, still believing in the cause. But Lee was telling the truth about the machinery. The engine had been pulled out. The horse was still running, but it was running on momentum, not power. The Pennsylvania campaign was the proof. The Army of Northern Virginia marched north, 75,000 strong, and looked in every way like the invincible machine it had been. Same flags, same veterans, same iron will. But the brain of the machine was gone, and the man who needed to translate the brain's intent into battlefield action was replaced by men who were good at their jobs, but not wired for this particular kind of war. After Gettysburg, Lee never invaded the North again. After Gettysburg, he stopped the grand gambles, the splitting of forces, the audacious flanking marches that had defined his generalship. He dug in, he built trenches, he fought from the defensive, not entirely by choice, but because the offensive tool he had relied upon for 2 years was lying in a churchyard in Lexington, Virginia. When Grant came east in 1864, he found an army of Northern Virginia that was already different, still dangerous, still lethal, still capable of brilliant tactical moments. But Grant noticed that Lee was no longer attacking the way he had attacked before. He wasn't making the deep, slashing flanking marches that had destroyed Pope and Hooker and Burnside. He was reacting. He was reading Grant's movements and adjusting. He was fighting a different war. Grant attributed this to the loss of manpower, to the grinding attrition of the Overland Campaign. This was partially true, but Lee's own staff, the men who had served through Chancellorsville and before, knew a different truth. The Army fought differently because the Army thought differently without Jackson in it. The nerve endings had been severed. The reflex was gone. History assigns the death of the Confederacy to many moments. Gettysburg is the standard answer. The fall of Atlanta, the siege of Petersburg, the slow strangulation of the blockade, these are all accurate. These are all real. But there is an argument, a cold and honest argument, that the Confederacy died on a dirt track in the Virginia wilderness on the night of May 2nd, 1863, when a trigger-happy regiment opened fire on the wrong horsemen. Not because one man's death could determine the outcome of a war fought by hundreds of thousands, but because this particular man was not replaceable, and the general who needed him knew it, admitted it in 5 quiet words, and had to live with the knowledge for the next 7 years, fighting a war that required a weapon he no longer had. The tombstone at Lexington, Virginia is plain. Thomas Jonathan Jackson, born January 21st, 1824, died May 10th, 1863. It does not say what he cost the Union Army. It does not say what his absence cost the Confederacy. It does not say that 51,000 men died at Gettysburg 2 months later, partly because a man who would have taken Cemetery Hill without being asked was not there to take it. It does not say that the long, grinding, terrible 2 years of warfare that followed, the trenches at Petersburg, the burning of Atlanta, the Shenandoah Valley scorched to ash, might have looked different if a North Carolina soldier had held his fire for 3 more seconds on a moonless Virginia night. It just says the dates. Robert E. Lee lived until 1870. He never wrote his memoirs. He refused to. He said he didn't want to do anything that would stir up strife between the sections. He said he wanted peace. He spent his final years as president of a small college in Lexington. He became the saint of the lost cause, the marble man, the symbol of noble defeat. He is buried 50 yards from Stonewall Jackson's grave. Lee's close friend, the Reverend William Pendleton, wrote that in Lee's final years, he almost never spoke of the war. He deflected questions. He changed subjects. He told young men to study hard and love their country and not to dwell on the past. But Pendleton also wrote that there was one name that could break through that wall of practiced composure. One name that, when spoken in Lee's presence, could stop the old general mid-sentence and send him somewhere else in his mind for a moment before he collected himself and moved on. Jackson. Just the name. That single syllable carried everything that Lee could not say about the war, about the Army, about the gap that opened in May of 1863 and never closed. The South needed a saint, so they gave it Lee. But Lee already had his saint, and his saint was buried in Lexington before the war was even halfway over. The most honest sentence Robert E. Lee ever spoke about the Civil War was not the famous ones. Not "it is all my fault at Gettysburg." Not "it is well that war is so terrible, lest we should grow too fond of it" at Fredericksburg. Not even the graceful dignity of Appomattox. It was 5 words spoken in a tent the afternoon of May 10th, 1863, when a messenger arrived and told him that Thomas Jonathan Jackson had crossed over the river. I know not how to replace him. He never did.